Today Matter.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. And I have to echo all of our other speakers by thanking Eddie and Thula for what's been a tremendously fun day, and I'm sure will only continue to get better. This has been really enjoyable, chaps, so thank you for putting that together. What I'm going to talk about today is the first draft of a new project for me. I'm a Kenyanist by training, that's where I've spent most of my career. And this is a project that came about initially from looking at the way that Mau Mau was refracted in the Caribbean. So the larger project is based, at least at this stage, on fieldwork in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Grenada, and in Antigua. And it's thinking about Africa and the Caribbean, and what Africa came to mean to different classes and social classes of people in the Caribbean islands. Now, when I say the Caribbean, I'm being a bit lazy. I'm talking about the Anglophone Caribbean here. Dealing with 20-odd countries and territories was more than enough, so this is really limited to British colonies. I'm also making the assumption that nobody has read the paper I'm delivering. I assume a few people had a look, but I'm going to just assume that perhaps it wasn't. Thank you very much to both of you. So as I say, I'd be hugely grateful for any thoughts or suggestions because this is very much in its early stage. Now, my adopted country these days is the United States, and if I was delivering that paper there, or rather this paper there, I would have to spend a minute or two talking about who Gary Sobers is. I hope I don't need to do that here, but when I'm talking about Gary Sobers, I'm talking, of course, of the famous cricketer from Barbados. By the 15th of September of 1970, probably the best-known cricketer in the world. He's already scored the highest individual total. He's a captain of the West Indies. It is no exaggeration to say that he is probably the most revered figure in the Caribbean at this stage. So on that day, in September 15th of 1970, Gary Sobers lands in Bridgetown, in Barbados. He's returning from Rhodesia, where he's just been engaged in a double wicket tournament. It's a one-day tournament. He's shown up for the better part of 36 hours. He's been paid £600 for playing there. He's been loudly feted by the Rhodesian crowd. And following the day's play, he has dinner with Ian Smith. And he's interviewed by a journalist, and he says, and I quote, "Smith is a tremendous man to talk to." Sobers has no idea of the firestorm that this is going to create. By the time he lands back in Barbados on the 15th of September, Radio Guyana has already aired a multi-hour program about his trip to Rhodesia that morning. With the exception of 3 people, everybody is highly critical of the Bajan. He's called a traitor. Others call for him to be sacked as captain of the West Indies. In Antigua, the Radical Workers' Voice, which is a union newspaper, describes him as, quote, a white black man, and suggests, and I quote again, that he had abdicated his responsibility to Africans everywhere and to all West Indians in particular. There happens, in fact, to be a West Indian diplomat in the Gambia at that exact moment that this is going on, and he is harangued by his hosts, who ask him, and I quote again, "How can we be blood brothers, as you've said, when one of your greatest ambassadors is having tea with Ian Smith and telling the world how good he is?" Sobers is, of course, pressed to explain his choice to visit Rhodesia. It simply had not occurred to him, he said, that anybody would have an issue with such a journey. In his view, sport and politics were 2 separate realms that didn't compete with one another. This is a rather stunning admission. This is barely 6 months after Trinidad and Tobago's Black Power revolution in February of 1970. Trinidad is in fact still under a state of emergency imposed by Prime Minister Eric Williams at that time. Perhaps we're being a little bit hard on Sobers. In truth, he differed very little from many middle-class educated folks in the Caribbean for whom Black Power and its related movements barely registered. This was indeed the line taken by the Antigua Labour Party, which spoke for poor working-class black Antiguans, which raged, and I quote, "He, Gary Sobers, is nothing but one of those who think that they were created a little above the average African." Men like Sobers are not related to the huge outpourings of public anger at events in South Africa and its related Rhodesia during the 1960s. Though this then is the topic of my paper today, it's an effort to consider the impact of Southern Africa on the Caribbean region from the early 1950s through the 1970s. I focus initially on the Commonwealth, and then I look at how popular protest appears across the region. I'm going to wrap up by taking an in-depth look at Guyana on the South American mainland to understand how some of these African topics are playing into local socio-political concerns. So let's begin by thinking about South Africa and the British Caribbean. UDI in Rhodesia is completely inseparable from the history of apartheid in South Africa. It is perceived by people in the Caribbean as simply an extension of the same thing, just in a slightly different region. Across the Caribbean, since apartheid is instituted in 1948, people have focused on South Africa and apartheid because this is a system that they recognize. Their own system of slavery and segregation in the Caribbean means that what is going on in Southern Africa is very, very familiar to people there. We tend to assume that the All Africa People's Conference, held in Accra in December of 1958, inspires the commencement of economic sanctions against South Africa. In fact, Jamaica has been talking about this for some months beforehand. They've been taking careful lists of what it is that South Africa provides Jamaica and trying to work out, can they implement sanctions against the apartheid regime without any disastrous economic consequences. As Jamaica then begins talking about this publicly and sending messages back to South Africa via London, it infuriates the South Africans. Britain is saying to Jamaica, please don't do this, but we recognize it's your right to do so. South Africa, for its own part, is threatening to torpedo the entry of the West Indies Federation into the Commonwealth. They're trying to strike a bargain, whereas if Jamaica does this, then they're going to block the entry of the entire West Indies Federation from joining the Commonwealth. Ultimately, Jamaica, together with Barbados, Grenada, and Dominica, in July 1959 will impose trade sanctions, with Jamaica taking the lead several years later in forming a resolution to exclude South Africa from the Olympic Games. Membership in the Commonwealth will become a battleground between South Africa on one hand and the Caribbean nations on the other, with Britain sitting in the middle trying to referee it and getting progressively more uncomfortable. In Jamaica, and I say this from having read, I don't think it's any exaggeration, probably 10,000 individual articles in the Jamaican daily press at this time, men and women are debating what it might mean if South Africa left the British Commonwealth. Their concerns really are, what would this mean to black workers if economic sanctions are placed on the country? Is this going to end up hurting black workers? Would it be better for South Africa to remain in the Commonwealth because at least that way other nations could exert some influence on it, which they would lose if South Africa were to leave? As always in Jamaica, there are outlying voices, or rather common voices from the middle and upper classes, who said things that contrasted with what poor Jamaicans thought. Author and politician Maurice Cargill represents this rather well. He becomes a politician a bit later. He's a very well-known radio personality at this time. And he suggests that South Africa absolutely should stay in the Commonwealth. Because, he says, what's the difference between Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah and South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd? As he puts it, they're both dictators, and they're practically the same when it comes to the denial of civil liberties and parliamentary democracy in their countries. He argues that if you're going to expel South Africa, you have to expel Ghana. And that, for a middle-class Jamaican, is a perfectly acceptable thing to say at this time. It contrasts, of course, to what lower-class Jamaicans are saying, these guys who have supported Marcus Garvey since the 1920s and 30s. Rhodesia provides the Commonwealth with an existential threat in a way that South Africa doesn't. The intellectual vervoet and Afrikaner intellectuals have expended an enormous amount of energy in decades before that, creating the notion of what it is to be an Afrikaner, and about Afrikaner history being so separate and distinct from British history. This, of course, is quite different from what Ian Smith, the former Air Force fighter pilot, thinks. And so, initially, Rhodesia's sovereignty is the question that the Commonwealth, and I should point out that this is a newly expanded Commonwealth. Almost all African nations have joined the Commonwealth at independence, so this is an organization that suddenly has a huge influx of nations from Africa and the Caribbean. And this is the big question about Rhodesian sovereignty. Central African Federation wraps up at the end of 1963. So in 1963 and 4, this is the question. It's about Rhodesia's sovereignty. And the reason that this perpetually comes up in the Caribbean is because it's not all just about the Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting, which is the big meeting that we all know about. A lot of this is about individual meetings of associations within the Commonwealth, such as, for instance, the Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting, which is due to happen in Jamaica in 1965. So this gives Jamaica a great problem. Here's Rhodesia wanting to come to this meeting, but Jamaica is saying if we let Rhodesia do this, then we're giving it a measure of sovereignty that we don't believe that it deserves. So it almost boils down to kind of 8-year-old schoolyard politics. This is Matthew won't talk to Michael, so Jane has to pass the message between the two. So Jamaica's saying, we're not going to write to Rhodesia because they're not on the same level for us, they're not an independent nation. So they say to Britain, could you pass this message on? And Rhodesia does the same thing back. And we just go round and round like this. It's made more complicated, of course, by the fact that Portugal does recognize Rhodesian representatives at this time. So the situation is finally poised. In July of 1966, Zambian President Kaunda informs his nation on the radio that Zambia will not send a team to the Commonwealth Games, due to be held in Jamaica in 1966. The Games themselves bring into sharp relief the incongruity of the Rhodesian white minority situation. Here we have athletes from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Sierra Leone, all pouring into Kingston to compete in games. This wonderful moment of kind of Pan-African unity at the same time that the white minority rule in Rhodesia is there. President Nyerere of Tanzania is, of course, threatening to leave the Commonwealth, and he and Kaunda will alternatively avoid attending Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting around this time as well. Before the end of 1966, Kaunda undertakes a tour of the Western Hemisphere. He visits the US, he goes to Canada, he goes to Chile, but most importantly, he also goes to Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and Guyana. In Kingston, he addresses the Jamaican Parliament. A regular columnist at the Daily Gleaner, which is Jamaica's oldest settler paper, really, comments on the splendid evenness and balance that Kaunda demonstrated there. They admire these characteristics, along with the gentleness and sanity, as they put it. This was a common trope. The commentator continues to point out that you couldn't imagine Jamaica's politicians acting in such a manner. This notion that one would take quote-unquote African peoples and African examples and use them to suggest how the Jamaican situation could be better. It's actually a very common thing that appears over and over in the press there. They're also very attracted by Kaunda's suggestion that force should be used to rein in the Smiths regime in Rhodesia. The use of any kind of physical force in this way is something that no prime minister anywhere across the Caribbean is going to suggest at this point. It would be anathema because they're largely moderate across the board. So let's turn now a little bit to more popular protest. In the early 1960s, African issues have taken on a new salience in Jamaica. This is built in part on the foundation of all the work that Garvey and Garvey's supporters had done from the 1920s onwards. In Jamaica, this is driven in significant part by the Rastafari, who are known across the island at this point, and have been appearing in the 1950s down at the Kingston docks, ready to go back to Africa. This is magnified by radio and television, which appear in Jamaica in the early 1960s for the first time. Radio can reach everybody by the early 60s. Television just appears at that point. And two events serve to catalyze the public reaction, the first of which is Sharpeville. I don't need to tell anybody in this room anything about Sharpeville. You know what I'm talking about. You know even the images I'm thinking about. Imagine being in Jamaica and television, that extraordinary technology having appeared for the first time, and what you see is Sharpeville. This has an enormous reaction. Everybody from politicians to Rasta groups are marching through Kingston. I'll give you an example of just one of these Rastafari groups, the United Races organ. And I'll quote here where their leader says that black men can no longer sit with their arms folded and allow white men to make fools of them. We need freedom now, and only by a revolution can we succeed. We also need arms, he said. British intelligence officials stated how the Rastas were incensed and had armed themselves and were declaring that the time had come to seize their freedom using violence if necessary. Sharpeville is enormously significant. The second thing is the assassination of Lumumba. Again, it's very hard for me to quantify this, and I can't really think of a good way to do it because it seems incredibly ugly to sort of say, well, there were 232 articles about Lumumba's assassination and 32 about something else. A, I don't have the patience to go back and do that, but B, this is really built on a sense of reading about marches and protests and all of these things that take place. Lumumba is hugely well known in the Caribbean at the time, particularly for the way that he stood up to the Belgians. And this has been heavily reported as well. Now, Britain had acted quickly to impose sanctions on Rhodesia, but it didn't do much to assuage anger in the Anglophone Caribbean. And the reason is that almost nobody is convinced by British protestations that they have no authority or ability to act in Rhodesia. This is a trope that we see coming up again and again. This is seen as an excuse. One of the, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Calypso here. And I spent a rather wonderful year last year on fellowship at Harvard when I sat in this wonderful office and I spent about 2 months listening to Calypso songs. And I'm fairly certain that nobody there thought I had done a damn bit of work that entire time, because day or night there was Calypso rhythms coming out of my office there. But it's a wonderful form of music, and particularly in Trinidad, this is how the streets speak. This is the voice of the people. Calypso is seen as a lower class protest. It is dismissed by people of middle classes. Calypso is where you find out your news. Calypso is it's the voice from the streets. So to quote Mighty Cypher, who is one of the most famous artists at this time, he sings a song called Rhodesia Crisis. A few of the verses, or rather lines, that go like this, and I'm not going to try and sing it, so don't worry about that. This man, Ian Smith, declares Rhodesian independence just so, without the Queen's consent. He quiets the present government and declares he owns the government. So if Great Britain is in charge, they should open his pants wide, that's Smith, and put Jack Spanier inside. Jack Spanier is a wasp. So they're saying that Britain should rein in Smith by placing a wasp inside his trousers. That's the allegory. 3 years later, another singer called Zebra sings Rhodesia Calypso Commentary, which highlights this double standard that he and others identify in the way that Britain has treated Rhodesia. People in the Caribbean are enormously aware of that phrase, the kith and kin, that Rhodesians are kith and kin of the British. And they believe that the British will not act because Rhodesians are white, quite simply. As Zebra sings it, you can see that I've been on both sides of the Atlantic by what I'm saying now. As Zebra sings it, you would have crushed Ian Smith to death had he been a black Mr. Smith. Great Britain had imposed an emergency in British Guyana in 1953. It had suspended the British Guyanese constitution. It brought warships to Trinidad when Black Power broke out in 1970. It sent troops and police to Anguilla in 1969 when it declared independence. And so, why not Rhodesia? All people could say was, well, this is because of color. Students are at the forefront of these protests. We all know about the University of the West Indies at Mona. That's the campus near Kingston in Jamaica, where Walter Rodney was the lecturer in history. Everybody knows about the riots in Jamaica in late 1968 when Rodney was denied entry back into the country. Well, this is also going on at the other big West Indies campus, which is St. Augustine in Port of Spain in Trinidad. As soon as Smith declares UDI, the students build an effigy of Smith, walk it down to the British High Commission in Port of Spain and set fire to it. They chant around the British High Commission singing, "One vote, black man, one vote." And Nkomo, yes, Smith, no, Wilson, no, Smith, no. They burn a Union Jack and mounted police have to break up the protest. It's also important to remember that there are quite a significant number of African students from the continent at the University of the West Indies at this time. So this has an immediacy and a relevance that perhaps might otherwise not be there. Issues of the student newspaper there reveal how Rhodesia's UDI had inspired students to start to critique themselves about the middle-class views that they held. Particularly in the way that they had dismissed things like steel band and calypso. Speakers on campus, invited by the students, called the student body to task for, quote, their apathy and ignoring of the lower class, the indifference to the commoner, and the individualism and remoteness of our upper class. Student authors came to recognize an odd duality that defined them. They were out there protesting colonialism at the drop of the hat, but they all went out in the streets and got Union Jacks to wave when royal dignitaries came to visit from Britain. This, of course, is the beginning of that transition into Black Power, which will characterize these campuses a year or two later. I won't push my point further, but I should simply say that we could be looking at unions, we could be looking at cultural organizations, all whom are engaged in this kind of work at this time. Now let me finish by talking about Guyana. In truth, I could be speaking about Jamaica or Trinidad quite easily here. But I want to think about the ways that Rhodesia and Africa came to play a role in the domestic political sphere here in Guyana. Now, given the audience that I have today, let me just say a few words about Guyana. This becomes an independent nation in 1966. And it is a country which had a racial mix of approximately, and I'm speaking broadest terms here, roughly 50-50 people of Indian descent and people of African descent. Pretty much right in the middle there. To make simple a very long and complicated racial history, by the early 1960s, we started to see clashes between the two racial groups, which seemed to be instigated in a pretty major way by two leaders. The socialist and, at least from the British perspective, sort of horned communist Cheddi Jagan, who is of Indian descent, and the man who ends up seizing power of African descent, who is Forbes Burnham. African topics, and especially those involving Southern Africa, become a zone of political battle between Burnham and Jagan. And we might add a third party, which is a Black Power group called Askria, led by a chap called Eusi Kwayana. He's taken a Swahili name. So we have Jagan of Indo-Guyanese descent, Burnham of Afro-Guyanese descent, and then a Black Power group on the margins as well. And paradoxically, it is Jagan, the Indo-Guyanese, who believes in the necessity of a guerrilla-style armed struggle here in the Caribbean. It's represented by people like Stokely Carmichael, who is a prohibited immigrant from just about every Caribbean nation at this stage. It's a way for Jagan to associate himself with Black Power and civil rights in the US by bringing people like Carmichael to Guyana. And it places Prime Minister Burnham in an extraordinarily difficult position. He's a man of African descent. He depicts himself as a supporter of black power, of African liberation. But in reality, he's rather opposed to the radicalism that black power represents. He cannot be seen to be denying entry to the country to somebody like Stokely Carmichael. How can you claim to support black power if you're not letting Stokely Carmichael come to your country? So Burnham ends up treading this rather fine line by being thoroughly opposed to everything that Carmichael represents, but not politically being able to stop him from entering his country. Both Cheddi Jagan and his wife Janet, who's an American, maintain a consistent line of focus on domestic and international issues in Africa and Asia, which is reflected in their party's newspapers. So Cheddi Jagan's position on Rhodesia as leader of the opposition is inseparable from the daily workings of Guyana's domestic political sphere. In January of 1969, Jagan writes to the Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting taking place that week to explain how Guyana and Rhodesia are similar. Smith's illegal fascist minority regime, Jagan writes, should be toppled with physical force. Rhodesia's lack of democratic process is parallel to that of Guyana, he says, accusing Burnham's party of stealing the elections. Jagan continues to explain how Guyana's vote rigging took place and that Guyana's domestic issues were also global issues, along with the Smith regime and the Biafran War. Burnham fought back by trying to establish himself as a mediator between ZANU and ZAPU in London. The explosion of black power in Trinidad in a revolution in February of 1970, in which part of the army mutinies as well, raises the stakes. The moderate Eric Williams immediately declares a state of emergency, calls in the troops, and immediately cables to Burnham and says, you know, you're 100 miles away from us, can you send us troops and weapons? This puts Burnham in an extraordinarily difficult position. He is threatened by black power and the radicalism it represents. If he helps Williams, the chances are that Williams will have to help him if the same thing happens in Guyana. But he cannot be seen to be sending weapons against black peoples. The only scenario, in fact, in which he will consider it is that if troops from Tanzania and Ghana are brought over to the Caribbean to help put down the rebellion. That is the only scenario in which he will consider doing so. Amazingly, such is the power of Askria, our black power group, that Burnham actually asks the leader of this group what he should do before he acts. So it's quite extraordinary the way all these things are mixing together here. A couple of months later, in 1970, Heath is considering reopening British arms trade to South Africa. Britain, as it's been earlier in the decade, is concerned about what will happen if in the Caribbean if the British do that. Is there a possibility that Caribbean nations will leave the Commonwealth if this takes place? So in the summer of 1970, communications are moving between the Caribbean territories, between London, between African countries, trying to work out what will happen in this scenario if Britain begins selling arms again. In Guyana, Burnham faces a problem. He has to oppose arms sales to apartheid South Africa. Politically, he can't do anything else. But he is also threatened by black power, and he is threatened by African nationalism, because people are holding up the ways that African countries have seized independence as something that should come in the Caribbean as well. Perhaps more pertinently, black power in Guyana and the importance of this group called Askria suggests that if African nations leave the Commonwealth, and the British tend to think that if 3 or 4 African nations leave the Commonwealth, Burnham will have no choice but to remove Guyana from the Commonwealth as well. The moral authority that would be conveyed by 3 or 4 African countries leaving the Commonwealth means that Burnham would have to do the same thing. This will put him in an impossible position. Britain is the major donor of aid to Guyana. In a country struggling as economically as Guyana is, that really isn't an option. And so Burnham does everything that he can to try to satisfy those black power Africanists in his country. He removes the Queen as a head of state. He makes Guyana a cooperative republic. He institutes a form of African socialism that is modeled on Nyerere's Ujamaa in Tanzania. But the reality is, and this is what Burnham will say to British officials, he has no interest in breaking from the British Commonwealth. And he tells them this in private. He says, when you hear me speaking on the radio tomorrow, I'm going to hammer you guys, but I don't really mean it, just so you know. So let me just tie up there in the interest of time. Forbes Burnham, as Prime Minister of Guyana, goes to the 3rd non-aligned summit in Lusaka in September of 1970. While he's there, of course, he receives news that just across the Zambezi, there's a young cricketer from Barbados who is playing in a tournament there. Puffing up his Pan-Africanist feathers, he issues an ultimatum to Sobers. He says, you're not welcome into Guyana or to play cricket here until you publicly apologize for what you've done. Hopefully from the explanation I've given you, you can see that politically he had no other option. Such was the anger that Rhodesia inspired in people across the Caribbean. In 1988, Michael Manley, who is a later Prime Minister in Jamaica, will describe how Sobers had been politically unconscious. He had simply missed the significance for peoples of the Caribbean that the Southern African situation had. It was an astonishing lack of awareness, but it was pretty common among middle-class people in the Caribbean. So the political situation in South Africa and Rhodesia played an important role in Caribbean history. Politicians talked about it at the hustings, Rastafari shouted about it in street meetings, and Calypsonians addressed it in song. From the streets to the State House, Southern Africa entered debate, intersecting with Pan-Africanism and black power in varied ways. It forced a reckoning of the relationship between newly independent and associated states with Britain, and demanded that black peoples of the region consider their relationships to those thousands of miles to the east. Thanks very much,
everyone. Thank you very much indeed, Myles. In your paper, you made express reference that Barbados was known as BIM, Britain in Miniature.
Yeah.
And of course, the 3rd University of the West Indies campus is at Cave Hill.
Yes.
What did Bayesian students make of this? And was there, in fact, a Bayesian dynamic to Sobers's behaviour that set Barbados apart from the rest of the Caribbean?
So Barbados is always known as Little England at this time. And it has a reputation of being the most sort of pro-British conservative country in the Caribbean. The University of the West Indies campus at Cave Hill is not significant at this time. It has only just opened and it's so small that we don't really hear too much coming out of there. I think that's why the Cave Hill campus is kind of quiet in all of this. I'm not even certain that it has in fact opened by that point, and if it has, it's tiny. One of the interesting things about Barbados, and it's not a place that I've done work, but even in Barbados, where you would expect to see nothing resembling support for radical movements, it is in fact there as well. And we have politicians during the height of Mau Mau in the 1950s in Barbados saying that they think something like that is actually quite a good idea. This is horrifying to the rest of Bajan society. But it just goes to show that I think when we do Caribbean history, perhaps more than other areas, because the sources are so rich in the newspapers and for looking and understanding middle class Caribbean peoples, it's very easy to forget that lower class, which often has very, very widely different views than the middle classes. And this is something that's still really prominent today. Middle-class Jamaicans will not claim ancestry in the African continent in most cases. It's just not a reality. It completely clashes with fact. But this is a middle class in Jamaica that prides itself on being very English and reading Shakespeare and doing all these kinds of things. So there's a real kind of clash of what's going on in classes there. It's why Marcus Garvey was enormously popular among lower class Jamaicans, and middle class Jamaicans thinks he's just a whack job. Yeah. Eddie.
Thank you for a great talk. Well, kind of you just preempted my first question when you drew a distinction between lower class and middle class, and so you essentially answered. My second part of my question is that I believe there's a very tiny white population in the Caribbean. Have you come across any evidence of white Caribbean opinion towards Ian Smith and UDI, or let's just say South African apartheid more generally?
The simple answer is no. And the reason for that is that I suspect if one went to do research in somewhere like Bermuda, you might come across something like that. But the white populations, as we would understand them, are very, very tiny in most of these islands. And generally when Jamaicans and some other peoples are talking about white, they generally mean light-skinned Jamaicans who are light brown phenotypically. So there's very little of that, and most of the European-descended whites are just keeping very quiet while all of this is going on. But this is something that over the course of the 1940s and into the 1950s, associating oneself with Africa is an appalling political move. By the 1950s and 60s, and some American commentators speak about this as well, you go from finding people like Alexander Bustamante, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, who we have extensive testimony of him dismissing black radical groups out of hand and writing to them and saying, don't bother me with your rubbish, don't waste my time, starting to talk about their African roots, however tiny those might be. This is a different era. This is an era in which Rastas have gone from being utterly dismissed lunatics, quite literally lunatics who were locking up in mental asylums, to, by the early 1960s, actually these guys might have something about them here. The Rastas get themselves accepted by the government in Jamaica in a way that is absolutely extraordinary. Yeah.
No, thank you for that very interesting talk. I just wondered whether you've looked into how the Caribbean voted in the United Nations General Assembly. Because when this issue came, when UDI occurred, it became a very hot issue in the UN. And one talks of the Afro-Asian bloc pushing for certain measures. Where were the Caribbean leaders here?
It's a great question. And the short answer is that I cannot give you a good response to that. The reason for that is that I've tried to spend most of my field work trying to dig into sort of people from below, essentially, doing interviews in places like Trenchtown and trying to talk to people who never appear in this. I'm absolutely certain there's material in the UN records, but I've tried to, I know I can come to that stuff later, so I've tried to steer away from that at this stage. So I can't give you a good answer, I'm afraid, on that.
When you do, most of the UN documents are now digitized.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's end this particular panel at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.